Hello, this is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service with reports and analysis from across the world. The latest news 7 days a week. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
This is the Global News podcast from the BBC World Service. I'm Rachel Wright, and in the early hours of Wednesday the 26th of October, these are our main stories. A Ukrainian minister has warned fellow citizens abroad against returning before the spring because Russian strikes have taken out much of the energy supply. Britain's new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is already facing criticism for reappointing a controversial Home Secretary days after she was forced out for breaching the ministerial code. The army in Sudan has fired tear gas to stop protesters marching on the presidential palace as people rallied to denounce the military rulers who seized power a year ago. Also in this podcast, turns out turtles and other sea creatures can talk after all. Who knew? Ukraine has urged citizens who are abroad not to return until the spring to help ease the pressure on the severely damaged energy system. The appeal comes after an international conference was held in Berlin to discuss Ukraine's reconstruction. After 8 months of conflict, parts of the country are in ruins. Drone strikes, bombs and missiles have all taken their toll. Addressing the conference in Berlin by video, Ukraine's President Zelensky said that Russian attacks had destroyed more than a third of his country's energy sector. There was a note of urgency in Ursula von der Leyen's voice as the President of the EU Commission told delegates that reconstruction had to begin immediately.
We have no time to waste. The scale of destruction is staggering. The World Bank puts the cost of the damage at 350 billion euros. This is for sure more than one country or one union can provide alone. We need all hands on deck.
Earlier, I spoke to Damien McGuinness, who's in Berlin.
Well, the conference is a pretty high-profile event, Rachel. It essentially is to start a process which Olaf Scholz calls a Marshall Plan for the 21st century, referring, of course, to that American programme which rebuilt Europe after the Second World War. And what participants and Western leaders say is that needs to start already, because you might ask, well, you know, the fighting hasn't stopped, so how can you rebuild Ukraine when things might get destroyed again? But in fact, what participants and Western leaders are saying is that this is such a complex process involving so many different actors, hundreds of billions of dollars potentially, that in order to make sure that goes to the right places, you need to start that coordination work straight away. And then on the other side, you've got the emergency infrastructure rebuilding, which needs to happen here and now, and that's to help Ukraine get through the winter.
So tell us the kind of damage we're talking about in Ukraine here.
Well, what's happened over the last few weeks, as you know, Rachel, is that Vladimir Putin has changed his tactics towards targeting energy infrastructure and key infrastructure in particular, which helps Ukraine's economy function and helps people get through their daily lives. And what's happened is that power stations have been damaged, roads, railways, schools, hospitals, the things you need for daily life are being destroyed. And all of this means, as the winter approaches, the fear is of a looming humanitarian disaster and a collapse in the economy. And that seems to be the Kremlin's tactic. Western leaders today have been saying, well, this isn't just about rebuilding Ukraine in the future, this is actually about rebuilding Ukraine now so that people can survive the winter.
As you say, this is a colossal task with billions of dollars needed. How much confidence do you feel there is that they will actually be able to stop this and avert a humanitarian disaster, as you say?
I think what people are aware is that the key thing is tackling certain issues. One of them is fighting corruption, because if you don't tackle that, no one's going to invest. The other is in incentivizing business leaders to invest in Ukraine. You know, many European leaders have said as Ukraine has a lot of potential. And Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, a key message that he kept on giving is that Ukraine will enter the EU. And he said to businesses, if you invest in Ukraine today, you're investing in a future EU state.
A group on the left fringe of the Democratic Party in the US House of Representatives has withdrawn a letter which called for a negotiated settlement to the war in Ukraine. The letter was a clear embarrassment to the Biden administration. Gary O'Donoghue is in Washington.
The chair of the Progressive Caucus, Pramila Jayapal, said the letter had been drafted months ago and congressional staff had released it now without it being vetted. With just 2 weeks to go before midterm elections, in which Democrats are attempting to retain a wafer-thin majority in the House, Ms. Jayapal said she regretted the letter was being interpreted as backing the position of some Republicans, who've suggested they would not continue to write blank cheques for Ukraine if they took control of Congress.
Britain's new Prime Minister has already run into controversy with one of his key appointments to Cabinet. Suella Braverman had resigned as Home Secretary last week after admitting that she sent out an email which broke ministerial rules on security. However, Rishi Sunak, who became Prime Minister on Tuesday, has now given the job back to her, prompting the Labour opposition to say he had put his party before the country. He became the first British Prime Minister of colour and the youngest Prime Minister for several hundred years. As he entered Downing Street, he praised his predecessor Liz Truss, but acknowledged the reasons why he was taking over.
Some mistakes were made, not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact, but mistakes nonetheless. And I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately. I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come.
So how did this compare to the long tradition of new Prime Ministers speaking outside Downing Street? Our political correspondent is Rob Watson.
Well, I think, Rachel, if you're to see these speeches on a sort of spectrum of the poetic on one side all the way to the prosaic or practical, it was very much on the prosaic and practical scale, because Rishi Sunak clearly doesn't do much in the way of emotion or sort of rhetoric. So what really struck me about it was the sort of sombre tone after the boosterism of Boris Johnson. Britain's the greatest country on earth. I think Mr. Sunak has correctly read the political mood that, given the squeeze in living standards, it would be crazy to talk like that. So I was also struck by his kind of keenness to carry out that delicate manoeuvre of both praising his predecessors but also putting vast amounts of distance between his style and theirs. The final thing that I noticed, I was struck by the lack of any reference to the fact that he was the first Prime Minister of colour, and no reference to his sort of personal feelings at this pretty extraordinary moment in British politics.
And he's made some appointments. We've heard of quite a few people that have been brought back in or who are staying in their jobs. What do you think this shows about his intentions?
I think what it shows about his intentions is that his priority is just somehow trying to bring together the amazingly fractious, divided, bad-tempered governing Conservative Party, which has looks pretty much ungovernable. And that's because what he's being very careful to do is not to upset supporters of previous Prime Ministers Liz Truss and Boris Johnson, to try and keep some of those key figures in the cabinet. If you look at one of the appointments, Suella Braverman, who's coming back to being the Home Secretary or Interior Minister, she is very much on what might be called the sort of nationalist right of the party. She's in favour of that policy of sending migrants to Rwanda. So I think it doesn't only show that he's having to try and keep all sides on board, but I think it also dispels any notion of Rishi Sunak as some sort of liberal lefty in comparison to Liz Truss, whether that comes to economic matters or indeed social policy.
Oh, he's clearly a very ambitious man who's wanted to be PM for a while, or so he says. But really, who would want that job right now?
You might ask that, but both in terms of the politics of it, because the Conservatives have been in power for 12 years and there just is a lot of bad blood out there, and they're not really in agreement on what the sort of post-Brexit vision of Britain should be. Also, just if you look out into the country, I mean, this is sort of spread out into the way people feel about stuff. I mean, this is a country full of anxious people about their standard of living. The Conservatives have utterly plummeted in the polls. Whenever you look, whether it's in his party, around the country or around the world, it just looks like the mother of all challenges.
Well, the new British Prime Minister inherits an economy with inflation at more than 10%, its highest rate in 40 years. It's much harder to buy things in the shops. For example, over the past year, the cost of vegetable oil has risen by 65%, pasta by 60%, tea 46%, and bread 38%. James Reynolds spoke to 3 people in England who are worried about paying their bills. Sharon Spice is a youth worker here in London. Lindsay, a single mother of 3 in County Durham in the north of England. And June Harris is retired and lives in a village near Nottingham in the English Midlands. He first heard from June.
I've always budgeted, but I do it more now and go for cheaper stuff because I just don't have the money to pay for things as I used to, and I don't have luxuries now. I mean, to me, a luxury is to go out for a meal occasionally, but it is a rare thing now because there's just not the money.
We're in late October, the weather's already turning and winter's really coming around the corner. June, are you okay with the heating in your house and being able to afford it?
Yeah, I don't turn my heating on too much, usually just say for an hour in the evening when it gets a bit cool and then turn it off again. Blankets are wonderful. I use quite a few of those.
We'll bring in Sharon, who's here in London. As you go about your life, Sharon, how are rising prices affecting you?
So it's affected me with my car in terms of petrol. I've seen that increase. It's only starting to decrease. My shopping every couple of weeks, if I go to the supermarket, is increased. So now I try and bargain shop. So I go to more than one shop to see if the prices are slightly different. And in terms of electricity, I have a smart meter. So that's kind of really affected me, and I've seen the squeeze and the high cost of living affects me in those ways.
Are there any things that you've stopped buying?
I've probably stopped eating out as much. Before, I might have gone out maybe 2 or 3 times a week with my friends, maybe for a meal or something. I don't do that anymore, and I do a lot more cooking at home. But I will bulk cook, so I'll cook all my meals on a Sunday, and then I will keep them in the fridge. So that means I just have to put them in the microwave every now and again. So I don't buy coffees anymore.
Thank you so much, Sharon. Let's bring in Lindsay, who's a single mother of 3. Hi, Lindsay. You've been listening to what June and Sharon have had to say about the measures they've had to take in their own lives. I wonder how your life is getting on.
Very similar to June and Sharon. So the cost of food, I'm also trying to do a little bit of bargain hunting when it comes to food shopping and maybe buying things that are in the reduced aisle that have a shorter sell by, use by date. We've tried to cut back on what I would call the luxuries. So I would have enjoyed sitting at home at the weekend having a couple of glasses of wine. So there's no alcohol now. Things that the children would have enjoyed, the chocolate treats, they may be going out for the odd meal at the weekend. All of those things have had to go. And one of the big things for me is the cost of the fuel for the car. Because I have a family car, it costs around about £110 to fill the tank, and I can easily fill up 4 times a month, it's an excessive amount of money, and that really hurts.
So inflation in the UK is on the agenda for Rishi Sunak. Meanwhile, presidents and prime ministers from around the world have been sending their congratulations to Mr Sunak, saying they hope for increased cooperation with Britain on a number of issues, from climate change and the energy crisis to trade and the war in Ukraine. Russia said it didn't expect relations with Britain to improve. And, as our diplomatic correspondent James Landau reports, President Biden might wish to work on his pronunciation of the new Prime Minister's name.
World leaders may be weary of welcoming yet another British Prime Minister. This is their 5th in 6 years. But the fact that Rishi Sunak is of Indian origin has resonated around the world, even if the US President, Joe Biden, didn't quite get his name right.
We've got news that Rishi Sunak is now the Prime Minister. Pretty astounding. A groundbreaking milestone, and it matters. It matters.
India's Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, said British Indians like Mr Sunak were a living bridge that could help transform historic ties into a modern partnership, a nod to the as yet unsuccessful talks to agree a trade deal between both countries. President Buhari of Nigeria said a British Asian Prime Minister would inspire young people across the Commonwealth. But for all the warm welcome and interest in his background, what many in the international community want to know is whether Mr. Sunak will provide Britain with the political stability that his predecessors have not. Take the war in Ukraine. Mr. Sunak has promised to reinforce Britain's support for Kyiv, but he's not committed to increase the defence spending that some believe that support might require. President Zelensky congratulated Mr. Sunak and said he was ready to continue strengthening the strategic partnership between Ukraine and Britain. As for Russia, the Kremlin spokesman said he did not see any preconditions, grounds or hope that there would be any positive change in relations with the UK in the foreseeable future. China's foreign ministry spokesman said Beijing would work with the new government on a basis of mutual respect. So Mr. Sunak enters Downing Street watched by a world that is curious, hopeful, but taking little for granted.
Next to Sudan, and the military has fired tear gas as tens of thousands of protesters marched towards the presidential palace in the capital. The protest took place to mark the first anniversary of a coup that halted a democratic transition. Will Ross reports.
Thousands of demonstrators took to the streets of Khartoum and other towns and cities, many waving Sudanese flags and chanting slogans against the military. Security forces fired vast numbers of tear gas canisters to stop people reaching the presidential palace. Doctors said a protester had been killed after being hit by a military vehicle, and close to 70 people needed treatment for injuries, including fractures. Given the dangers, it's extraordinary how large and frequent the protests have been over the last year. It shows the depth of anger at military rule. The generals in charge have reappointed some allies of the former president Omar al-Bashir, complicating efforts to negotiate a democratic transition in Sudan.
As we heard earlier, in just 2 weeks, Americans will take to the polls for the midterm elections. And, of course, one issue expected to increase turnout and voter enthusiasm in key battleground races is abortion. 13 states have already introduced severe restrictions after the Supreme Court overturned the Roe v. Wade legislation. And these elections will determine whether abortion remains legal in several others. Our North America editor, Sarah Smith, sent this report from Michigan.
Clip up! Picture a small, single-engine plane sitting in your garage, ready to be wheeled onto a runway that's just behind your house, anytime you like.
Place traffic, Centurion 76110.
That's the reality for amateur pilot Tim Drager.
Hey, here we go.
And now he's volunteering to use his Cessna 210 to transport pregnant women from states which have banned abortion to places where they can legally terminate a pregnancy. Tim took me up in the air over central Michigan.
We're the country that espouses freedom. We say we have freedom of choice for a lot of things. Here, I have to use that same freedom to help women find the freedom that they deserve, that they've had for 50 years, and that's what I hope we can push.
Abortion is literally on the ballot here in Michigan. There's a special proposition asking voters if they want to enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution. It's known as Proposal 3. 4 other states have similar abortion referendum questions on the midterm ballots.
Lord Jesus Christ, we come before you again.
St. Mary's Church in Bloomfield Township, and there's well over 100 people here who've come for this special holy hour, praying for the defeat of the ballot proposition on abortion rights. Father Alex Kratz is organising the opposition to the abortion proposal.
I don't feel like I'm campaigning. I'm preaching the gospel, and the gospel has political ramifications. It's really not that difficult to see what you need to do and how you should vote. We think the fundamental right is not abortion, but life.
Anti-abortion advocates celebrated when the Supreme Court ended the nationwide constitutional right to abortion. Like the worshippers here at St. Mary's, they are campaigning to defeat Proposal 3.
Why is it a right to kill your own child? I don't understand why they think they're losing something.
We've lost the whole idea of life as sacred.
In states like Michigan, large numbers of women have been registering to vote, outnumbering new male voters.
Across America, about half of voters say the Supreme Court decision has made them more motivated to turn out and use their vote. Alyssa Slotkin, the Democratic Congresswoman for Michigan's 8th District, is in a very tight race for re-election and clearly believes that if voters are focused on abortion rights, that will give her a significant advantage.
To go to a total ban that doesn't have any exceptions for rape or incest, that says if you're having a miscarriage, you have to wait until you're deathly ill to get a procedure, that is not something we're going to allow here. It rolls us so deeply backwards.
Instead of talking about the rising cost of living, Democrats like Ms Slotkin would much rather warn voters about strict abortion limits many Republicans advocate. Anti-abortion campaigners are also out on the streets.
Lead us not into temptation.
They have spent decades demanding an end to abortion, and the Republican Party has often used the issue to rally their base. But now it appears the furious backlash provoked by the removal of abortion rights could cost Republicans votes.
Pro-life is a right!
Still to come.
I was able to stand outside the National Museum of Qatar on a main road for about 35 minutes before the security services arrived.
The LGBT campaigner Peter Tatchell was briefly detained in Qatar for staging a protest about homophobia just weeks before the start of the 2022 Football World Cup. Thousands of mourners in the occupied West Bank have marched through the city of Nablus during funerals held for 5 Palestinians killed in an Israeli raid. Israel says it was responding to the killing of a soldier earlier this month. Palestinian leaders have described raids in the West Bank as war crimes. Our Middle East correspondent Tom Bateman sent this report.
I'm in the old city of Nablus. Smashed glass, rubble underfoot, and above me the remnants of a building, its windows completely blown out. The stone walls are pockmarked with shrapnel and bullet holes.
Rayak Al-Hammouz was in bed when he says Israeli troops fired a missile at his neighbour's house. I saw it come in, all this glass fell on us. The explosion was forced into that building. We took the kids and we ran downstairs, he says. The Israeli raid started around midnight. Residents say it was bigger than anything in 15 years, sparking armed clashes with Palestinian gunmen. Israel said it was targeting the base and explosives factory of the Lion's Den, an emergent Palestinian militant group which has rapidly developed a popular base via social media. A commander was killed along with 2 other gunmen. Palestinians used loudspeakers to call on locals to defend their city. Men poured onto the streets. In another serious development, there was an exchange of fire between Israeli troops and the official, internationally backed Palestinian security forces, sparking further fears the situation in the occupied West Bank could rapidly worsen. Israel's search and arrest raids this year have led to mounting Palestinian deaths amid a deadly wave of violence by Palestinians against Israelis. The Palestinian leadership called for international help, describing the raids as a war crime. Israel's Prime Minister said they'd intended to strike hard and that he wouldn't allow cities to become a refuge for terrorism.
In India, the technology company Google has been fined just over $113 million after the authorities there conducted an antitrust investigation. The Competition Commission of India has claimed that Google has been abusing its market position to promote its payment app and in-app payment system. The BBC's Davina Gupta explains more.
What essentially it means is if you download an app on your phone in India and you want to make an in-app purchase, you want to unlock new features, say in that gaming app, you must use Google's Play's billing system, which is used as method of payment for those transactions. Now, it's a tricky position for many app developers because they have no choice but to pay commission to Google for each of these transactions, and some of them claim it could go between 15 to 30%. Google has faced similar controversies in other countries as well, including the US, where it faced backlash from some app developers for going against its ethos, which essentially is about an open system and more liberal system than what many Apple users have. In India, this is also about big bucks for the company because it's a different game. We are talking about big numbers, 750 million smartphone users, majority of them on Android operating systems. So Google actually makes a lot of money this way, and the antitrust body in India conducted this probe in late 2020. It has now completed that probe and has imposed financial penalty. It has asked Google to let third-party payment vendors on its platform, and it has given the company 3 months to do so. Well, Google has said its legal team right now is evaluating this order.
It's just under a month till the 2022 Football World Cup kicks off in Qatar. It's the first time a Middle East nation has hosted the tournament, and it's the first time it's taken place in winter. The build-up to the competition has also made headlines for the wrong reasons. Human rights groups say many thousands of construction workers have died. And on Tuesday, the LGBT campaigner Peter Tatchell was detained in Doha for staging a protest about homophobia in the country.
I was able to stand outside the National Museum of Qatar on a main road for about 35 minutes before security services arrived. They then summoned the police, and then myself and my colleague, we were detained for 49 minutes and subjected to interrogation by police and security service agents.
He was later released by the Qatari authorities. They have denied that he was arrested. The Emir of Qatar has said that criticisms regarding the country were misinformation and are tantamount to slander. I asked our sports editor Ben Sutherland why he'd spoken out now.
I think at this point in time, you can see that there is, at the highest levels in Qatar, now a real concern around what they're calling misinformation. Now, you may have seen, many of the people listening may have seen only a few weeks back, a post that went super viral that was all about, if you like, advice to people visiting Qatar, that was saying things that are frowned upon or that people should not do when they go to Qatar, which included homosexuality, which also included things like dating, it said, drinking of alcohol. To an extent, it played into people's prejudices about a tournament that's being held in the Muslim world. This is the first time that a World Cup has been held in a country in the Middle East with a strong conservative Muslim population and government.
And do you think that it has put a lot of people off the actual tournament?
I think it's an incredibly fascinating question. Now, for football fans, especially from the West, from Western Europe, there is an association with football that involves a culture around drinking, that involves a culture of fans really getting together, having a great time abroad. There was perhaps never going to be that same level of connection with a country like Qatar as there would have been for a country like Russia or even Brazil before that, or even South Africa before that, and certainly Germany in 2006. So it may be, from a point of view, that there would be some fans who are put off by things like the fact that homosexuality is illegal in Qatar, but I suspect that far more fans would be put off from going simply because of the fact that it is a small country, it is very expensive, and it has its attitude towards alcohol is rather conservative.
Now, the BBC understands that the car company Ford is to discontinue production of the Fiesta as early as next year. Since its introduction in the 1970s, more than 20 million vehicles have been sold worldwide, but its popularity has dwindled in recent years. Ford said it would not comment on any speculation. Here's our business correspondent, Theo Leggett.
The Ford Fiesta was once the most popular small car in Europe, but now it's approaching the end of its road as the company itself prepares to head in a new direction. It was first launched onto the market in 1976 and has been built at factories all around the world, but nowadays production is confined to Germany. Ford is in the process of transforming its business to focus on electric vehicles and is moving away from the designs that were its bread and butter. Production of the Mondeo ended earlier this year, and the final Focus will roll out of the factory in 2025. The company wants to create a new lineup of more exotic electric models, which exploit evocative brand names, in the same way as the existing Mustang Mach-E and F-150 Lightning.
A scientist has discovered that 53 marine animals that were believed to be silent can, after all, communicate through sound. The findings suggest that the origins of acoustic communication in vertebrates, such as turtles and reptiles, can be traced back to a single ancestor 400 million years ago. As our science reporter Georgina Ranard explains, that's significantly earlier than previously thought.
The sound scientists thought did not exist, until, that is, Gabriel Yorgovich-Cohen went out with his microphone. It was believed these creatures lived in silence, but on a mission to satisfy his curiosity, the PhD student from the University of Zurich recorded 50 species of turtle, a tuatara, which is a lizard-like reptile from New Zealand, a lungfish, and a caecilian, a limbless amphibian. By observing their behaviour, he concluded that the animals made sounds such as these to send specific messages. As he explains, for turtle hatchlings, it's a case of strength in numbers.
Some species will start singing from within the egg to synchronize hatch. Because if they call from within the egg, they all come out together, and then it is less costly for each one of them to dig out. They have less chances individually of being predated because they are all going to the ocean.
He also says these weird and wonderful sounds open the door to a new understanding of evolution. Scientists used to think that acoustic communication came from multiple ancestors, a mere 200 million years ago. But by tracing animal behaviour through time, Mr. Yorgovich-Cohen claims it may have descended from just a single ancestor, 400 million years ago. A big statement based on the tiniest of noises.
And that's all from us for now, but there will be a new edition of the Global News Podcast later. If you want to comment on this podcast or the topics covered in it, you can send us an email. The address is globalpodcast@bbc.co.uk. This edition was mixed by Chris Hansen. The producer was Liam McSheffrey. The editor is Karen Martin. I'm Rachel Wright. Until next time, goodbye.
What's it like working as an outsider, as an American, inside arguably the most secretive country in the world, North Korea?
And how do you go about tracking hackers in real time, even reading their messages?
I'm Jean Lee. I opened the first and only U.S. news bureau in North Korea.
And I'm Jeff White, an investigative journalist covering tech and organised crime.
And we're back with a brand new episode of our podcast, The Lazarus Heist, recorded in front of a live audience in New York City.
We're joined on stage by a North Korean defector and a cybersecurity expert who tracks hackers.
And there's even some advice about trying to keep yourself safe from hackers online.
That's our new special live episode of The Lazarus Heist, the podcast about hacking and North Korea. The Lazarus Heist live show, it's available now.
And we're excited to tell you we're returning soon with a second season of The Lazarus Heist.
So if you haven't done so already, what better moment to listen to the whole of Season 1? Or, if you've heard it already, listen again. Remind yourself of the story.
For the new episode, and for the whole of the first season, search for The Lazarus Heist wherever you found this podcast.